Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Ava's descent into darkness truly began the moment she made the fateful decision to keep Rick captive and control him with sleeping pills. In her mind, it was a temporary solution, a way to silence him and ensure he posed no immediate threat for 30 days. The precise span of time she needed for her financial schemes and carefully laid plans to unfold. She convinced herself that Rick, no matter how dangerous and unpredictable he was, could not possibly escape if his body was weakened, his mind clouded, and his very survival dependent on the dosages she alone provided. Yet what Ava mistook for a clever precaution was in reality a trap of her own making. Administering sedatives without medical supervision was reckless at best, lethal at worst, and she knew the dangers even as she pressed forward. The combination of her deep-seated hatred for Rick and her fear of being exposed pushed her to embrace a short-term fix without considering the inevitable long-term consequences that would soon spiral beyond her control. In the early days of her plan, Ava still clung to a false sense of control. She carefully orchestrated her acquisition of the pills, presenting herself to Lucas as an exhausted, restless woman plagued by insomnia. With practiced ease, she wore the mask of vulnerability, her voice trembling with just enough desperation to convince him she needed help. Lucas, believing her story, agreed to prescribe what he thought would be a harmless 30-day supply. What he could never have imagined was that those very pills were destined for Rick, hidden away in the shadows of captivity. Ava felt emboldened once the small bottle was in her hands. She reassured herself that as long as Rick remained sedated, the situation was manageable. Each time she crushed a pill into his water or slipped a dose into his food, she believed she was buying herself more time, keeping him docile, and securing her fragile illusion of safety. But Rick was not a man easily subdued. Even in confinement, his instincts sharpened, and he began piecing together the reality of his imprisonment. Every time he regained enough clarity to look her in the eyes, there was defiance in his gaze, a chilling reminder that he was still very much a threat. He didn't need to speak for Ava to feel the promise of vengeance radiating from him. Those moments shook her composure, gnawed at her confidence, and left her lying awake in the nights she had claimed were sleepless. What if Rick broke free? What if he found a way to turn the tables? The thought of facing his retaliation became unbearable, and Ava's response was to increase the dosage. If one pill kept him quiet, 2 would silence him longer. If 2 dulled his spirit, 3 would keep him under 4 hours. She told herself it was necessary, that she was only doing what had to be done to survive. Yet with every escalation, she unknowingly edged closer to disaster. The breaking point came on a night when fear and anger merged into one reckless act. Rick had spent the day glaring at her with a raw intensity that unsettled her to the core, a silent declaration that he was waiting for his moment. Ava, shaken and desperate, convinced herself that he needed to be pushed deeper into sedation than ever before. With trembling hands, she prepared a dose far stronger than any she had dared give him before. In her mind, she rationalized it as self-preservation, convincing herself that if Rick slept through the night without interruption, she would finally feel secure. But Ava failed to account for what captivity had already done to him. Days of poor nutrition had left his body frail, his system taxed by the strain of confinement and the constant chemical assault. When the excessive dose coursed through his veins, his body could no longer resist. His breathing faltered, shallow gasps turning into silence, until finally, Rick's life slipped away in the suffocating stillness of the darkened room. The sight of his motionless body shattered Ava. The reality crashed down with suffocating clarity. She had crossed a line that could never be undone. She stood frozen, paralyzed by the enormity of what she had done, watching the lifeless shell of the man she once only intended to control. Panic surged through her veins, her mind racing with the knowledge that this was no longer about manipulation or delay, it was murder. In that instant, all the lies she had told herself collapsed. She could no longer pretend she was simply keeping Rick quiet. She had silenced him forever. And with his death, the fragile illusion of control she had clung to disintegrated, leaving Ava face to face with a truth that terrified her more than Rick's threats ever had. There was no turning back. Ava's decision not to confess but instead to construct an elaborate deception was not born of a single fleeting impulse. It was the culmination of her deepest fears. Her ruthless instinct for survival, and her uncanny ability to twist circumstances in her favor. In those moments after Rick's death, when silence filled the warehouse like a suffocating weight, Ava's mind raced with images of police interrogations, headlines branding her a murderer, and the slow, humiliating destruction of everything she had fought to secure. Her world was built on fragile layers of control and appearance, her reputation in Port Charles, her influence in business and society, and the delicate balance of power she maintained among allies and enemies alike. To admit what had happened would not simply strip her of freedom, it would annihilate her very identity. It was this sheer terror of erasure that gave birth to the cold calculation that followed. The choice of Alexis as a scapegoat was not made lightly, nor was it purely out of convenience. Ava understood that in order to redirect suspicion, the substitute had to be both believable to the authorities and defenseless enough to be enabled to unravel the trap. Alexis checked every box. She had a documented history of conflict with Rick. Their tangled past involved legal battles, betrayals, and more than one instance of confrontation that had spilled into public view. Alexis was intelligent, but her personal life was riddled with flaws, broken relationships, questionable decisions, and a constant struggle to balance her career with her family obligations. To Ava, this made her the perfect target, credible enough to fit into the narrative of Rick's demise, yet vulnerable enough to be overwhelmed once the machinery of suspicion turned against her. Ava began piecing together the mechanics of her trap with a precision that was almost surgical. She knew Alexis would not wander into the warehouse of her own accord, so she manipulated subtle triggers to ensure her arrival. Perhaps it was an anonymous message hinting that Rick was in danger, or a fabricated lead suggesting Alexis's presence was required to protect her daughters from Rick's threats. Ava weaponized Alexis's protective instincts, knowing that no matter how cautious she might be, Alexis would act if she believed her family was at stake. By luring her into the same dark space where Rick's body lay cold, Ava aligned the timing and environment to create the illusion that Alexis had come face to face with Rick, and that their confrontation had ended fatally. What elevated Ava's scheme from cunning to devastating was her orchestration of law enforcement's arrival. Timing was everything. It was not enough for Alexis to stumble upon Rick's body. She had to be caught there, framed by the damning tableau of a dead man and her proximity to him. Ava leveraged her network and her understanding of how the authorities operated. She ensured the call went out at the exact moment Alexis would step into the warehouse, guaranteeing that officers would storm in before Alexis had any chance to comprehend what had happened. By the time the flashlights cut through the darkness and the shouts filled the room, Alexis was already ensnared. The scene unfolded with chilling efficiency. Officers entered to find Rick's lifeless body sprawled across the cold floor, the stench of decay mingling with the faint chemical trace of sedatives. Standing nearby, disoriented and horrified, was Alexis. Her expression alone, shock mingled with confusion, was enough to betray how unprepared she was for the spectacle. Yet in the eyes of the law, appearances were everything. The optics were damning. Alexis had been discovered at the exact moment a man with whom she had a turbulent history lay dead. Even before she spoke, she was guilty in their minds. Alexis tried to explain, words tumbling out in frantic desperation, her voice straining with urgency as she insisted she had nothing to do with Rick's death. But the more she spoke, the deeper the pit seemed to grow. Every denial sounded like a calculated lie, every plea for reason twisted into self-preservation. The officers saw only what Ava had designed them to see: motive, opportunity, and presence at the scene of the crime. For Alexis, truth was suddenly powerless. Evidence fabricated, circumstantial, or coincidental is now the arbiter of her fate. Behind the scenes, Ava held herself back, watching her design spring to life with almost theatrical precision. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she observed the chaos. She felt the tremor of fear, the remnants of panic over Rick's death, but she also felt an intoxicating rush of triumph. She had outmaneuvered fate, at least for now. Alexis was in custody. The investigation had a clear suspect, and Ava's own hands, though stained in reality, appeared clean in the eyes of the law. It was the ultimate illusion. She had shifted the narrative from herself to another, leaving Rick's death as a burden Alexis would have to carry. Yet beneath the thrill of survival lay a shadow that Ava could not entirely silence. She knew the fragility of her victory. The plan had succeeded in its first stage, but the machinery of justice was unpredictable. Investigators could dig deeper, loose ends could unravel, and people who knew Eva too well could begin to suspect the truth. For now, though, she embraced the illusion of control, clinging to the belief that she had done what was necessary. Eva's mask of composure returned, and as Alexis was led away in handcuffs, bewildered and broken, Eva allowed herself the fleeting comfort of a predator who had momentarily evaded capture. Molly's descent into heartbreak and fury after Rick's death was not something that happened in a single moment. It unfolded like a slow-motion collapse of everything she had once believed in. At first, the sheer shock of losing her father was enough to paralyze her. Rick had been a complicated man, unpredictable at times, but he was still her father, still a part of her life that she thought would always exist. The finality of his death struck her like an iron weight pressing down on her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. Yet before she could even process the magnitude of that loss, a darker revelation hit her: sight of her mother, Alexis, standing at the crime scene, surrounded by officers, with Rick's lifeless body sprawled at her feet. That vision etched itself so deeply into Molly's mind that it began to override memory, reason, and even love. For a young woman who had built her trust in her mother piece by fragile piece, it was as though the foundation of her world had crumbled in an instant. In her heart, Molly had always believed Alexis to be her protector. Despite Alexis's flaws, her turbulent romantic history, and the mistakes she had made in judgment, Molly clung to the belief that her mother's love for her children was unshakable. But now that image lay shattered. What she saw was not a mother shielding her child from pain, but a woman branded by suspicion, caught in the worst possible circumstances. Each time Alexis tried to reach for her, to speak, to insist upon her innocence, Molly felt the words sting rather than soothe. They sounded less like truth and more like excuses, and in Molly's grief-stricken mind, they only deepened her anger. Instead of comfort, Alexis became the focus of her rage. Instead of a safe harbor, Alexis became the storm that had destroyed her family. The hatred that took root in Molly's heart was not instantaneous. It germinated slowly, fed by her grief and confusion. At night, she would replay the scene in her mind: her father dead, her mother standing above him, the officers' flashlights cutting through the darkness, and Alexis's frantic voice protesting innocence. The more Molly replayed it, the more she convinced herself of Alexis's guilt. Even if her mind whispered questions, her heart silenced them, demanding someone to blame. That blame fell squarely on her mother. Her grief curdled into something harder, sharper: refusal to forgive, or refusal to listen. She walled herself off, telling herself that Alexis was no longer worthy of her trust, that her mother had not only taken her father's life but also destroyed the fragile family they had left. Meanwhile, Port Charles itself seemed to twist under the weight of the scandal. The death of Rick Lansing was not merely a personal tragedy. It became a public drama, whispered about in cafes, dissected in courtrooms, and speculated on in hushed voices at the hospital and the police department. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone took sides. To some, Alexis's history of volatile relationships and personal missteps painted her as a woman capable of snapping under pressure. To others, she was the victim of a setup too convenient to ignore. Yet what stood out most was the fracture within her own home: Molly's visible hostility toward her mother. That kind of betrayal spoke louder than evidence, louder than witness testimony. If a daughter could not believe in her mother's innocence, why should anyone else? In the eyes of the community, Alexis's credibility crumbled further with each passing day. Molly refused to stand by her side. Eva, on the other hand, watched all of this from the shadows with a sense of grim satisfaction. Her plan had unfolded almost exactly as she envisioned. Rick was gone, Alexis was branded a murderer, and suspicion had swerved far away from her. Yet beneath the satisfaction simmered a gnawing unease. Eva knew better than anyone that lies had a way of unraveling, that secrets in Port Charles rarely stayed buried for long. What haunted her most, however, was not just the risk of discovery but the ghost of Rick himself. In quiet moments, she saw him in her mind's eye, felt the weight of what she had done, and wondered if every step she took from now on would be shadowed by his memory. The relief of shifting blame to Alexis was fleeting. The paranoia that the truth would surface one day was permanent. For Alexis, the nightmare was suffocating. On one hand, she fought a legal battle to prove her innocence, staring down prosecutors who were eager to make an example of her. On the other, she faced the more intimate, crushing punishment of her daughter's scorn. The courtroom was a battlefield, but the silence in her home, the absence of Molly's trust, was far worse. She longed to reach her daughter, to explain, to reassure her that she had not taken Rick's life. Yet every attempt at conversation was met with Molly's coldness, her refusal to hear anything beyond the narrative she had already embraced. The rejection was unbearable. Alexis was not just fighting for her freedom, she was fighting for the soul of her family, and every day that passed made it clearer that she might lose both. Molly, meanwhile, found herself spiraling deeper into her own darkness. Friends tried to console her, but she withdrew, isolating herself in her grief and her anger. Her pain was a wound she refused to let heal, because healing would mean questioning her hatred of Alexis. And questioning that hatred would mean facing the terrifying possibility that she had condemned her mother unjustly. So she clung to her rage like armor, letting it guide her, even as it hollowed her out from within. She was no longer just a grieving daughter, she was a girl consumed by vengeance against the one person who should have protected her above all else. The tragedy of Rick's death thus expanded far beyond one man's life. It tore apart a family, reshaped a community, and chained multiple lives to a lie. Ava, believing she had escaped accountability, instead became enslaved to her own guilt and paranoia. Alexis, once a mother and protector, now stood vilified and abandoned, forced to fight not only the courts but the condemnation of her own child. And Molly, who should have been comforted and shielded in her grief, was instead twisted by it, her sorrow transmuted into a weapon against the very person who still loved her most. In Port Charles, the ripple effects of this crime spread endlessly outward, poisoning relationships, breeding suspicion, and ensuring that no one touched by Rick's death would emerge unscarred. Rick's death, though it might have appeared at first glance to be a tragic but isolated loss, soon revealed itself to be the beginning of a vast and far-reaching storm that would leave no one untouched. His final breath inside that darkened warehouse was not merely the conclusion of his life but the spark that ignited a sequence of events that would ripple outward, twisting lives, dismantling bonds, and reshaping the very fabric of Port Charles. What Ava had intended as a solution to silence a threat instead unleashed a chain reaction of pain and suspicion that could not be contained. In the days and weeks that followed, his absence became not only a void in the lives of those who knew him but also a haunting presence that infected every decision, every glance, and every whispered rumor in town. Ava believed in those first tense hours after his death that she had managed to redirect the consequences away from herself. She had executed her deception with calculated precision, placing Alexis at the center of suspicion and convincing herself that the matter was resolved. But in truth, what she had created was not safety but a prison of her own design. Every lie told to conceal her role became a weight pressing down on her chest. Every whispered conversation about Rick's demise in the hallways of the courthouse or the back tables of the Metro Court felt like a dagger aimed at her heart. She could not escape the knowledge that she alone bore responsibility, and though others might be deceived for now, Ava's mind was a battlefield where guilt and paranoia clashed endlessly. The satisfaction she briefly felt in framing Alexis evaporated quickly, replaced by the exhausting reality of maintaining her facade. Alexis, on the other hand, found herself in the eye of the storm, forced into the role of accused murderer despite her innocence. The cruel irony was that she, who had always devoted her life to upholding the law, was now vilified by the very system she had once served. In courtrooms where she once stood as a respected advocate, she now sat at the defense table, her reputation unraveling thread by thread. The prosecutors built their case against her piece by piece, her turbulent history with Rick, her presence at the crime scene, the testimony of officers who had seen her standing over his body. Even as she fought to present her truth, the tide of perception was against her. To the public, perception was as powerful as fact, and the image of Alexis in that warehouse was burned too deeply into the collective memory to be erased easily. For Alexis, however, the greatest wound did not come from the prosecutors or the whispers of the community, it came from her daughter. Molly's grief, once pure sorrow, had transmuted into suspicion and rage. Every time Alexis tried to reach out, to plead her innocence, she was met with coldness, even hostility. Molly, shattered by the loss of her father, could not bring herself to believe her mother's words. Instead, she clung to the only explanation that made sense in her grief-stricken heart, that Alexis had taken Rick from her. This belief carved an ever-deepening chasm between mother and daughter, one that threatened to become permanent. For Alexis, the rejection of her child was a punishment far harsher than any sentence the courts could deliver. Molly herself became a living embodiment of the tragedy's cruelty. She was a young woman trapped in a labyrinth of grief and anger, her heart torn between love and hate, her mind clouded by images she could not forget. The memory of her father's lifeless body, of her mother surrounded by police officers, became a nightmare she relived daily. To cope, she armored herself in anger, directing her pain at Alexis because it was easier than accepting the uncertainty of Ava's lies. Her sorrow found no outlet except through resentment, and as that resentment grew, it began to reshape her very identity. Molly was no longer simply Rick's daughter or Alexis's child. She was a young woman consumed by the need to assign blame, to make sense of a senseless loss by turning her back on the person who loved her most. The community of Port Charles, already fractured by countless scandals and betrayals in the past, now found itself consumed by this new drama. Rick's death dominated conversations everywhere, from the General Hospital corridors to the offices of City Hall, from the police station to Sonny Corinthus's penthouse. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone whispered about guilt and innocence. To some, Alexis was clearly guilty. Her history with Rick made the narrative plausible, her presence at the scene undeniable. To others, she was a scapegoat, and fairly targeted by forces working in the shadows. Yet regardless of where loyalties lay, the tragedy became a communal obsession, dividing the town into factions and poisoning relationships that had once been secure. Rick's death also carried political weight. His connections, his knowledge of secrets, his history of manipulation, all of it meant that his absence created opportunities and dangers alike. People who had feared what Rick might reveal were suddenly emboldened, while others wondered who might now wield the information he left behind. His death did not close doors, it opened them, and the consequences of that shift began to ripple outward in ways Ava could not have foreseen. Through it all, the unshakable truth lingered like a specter: no crime can remain hidden forever. Ava's deception might have succeeded in the short term, Alexis might be branded with guilt, and Molly might turn her grief into hatred, but the truth was not gone. It was buried beneath layers of lies and fear, waiting for the moment to rise. And when it did, it would not only demand justice for Rick but also devastate those who had allowed themselves to be ensnared in the web of deceit. Ava's face, so carefully masked, would be revealed for what it was, the face of a murderer who believed she could outwit fate. Thus, Rick's death became not an ending but the grim beginning of a saga that would stretch across families, friendships, and the entire town. Ava was shackled by her guilt and paranoia, Alexis was imprisoned by suspicion and her daughter's rejection, and Molly was consumed by hatred born of grief. Together they formed a tragic triangle, each one a prisoner of the same nightmare, each one unknowingly moving closer to the inevitable moment when truth would erupt from the shadows. The ghost of Rick, unseen but unyielding, bound them together, ensuring that this was not a story of closure but of escalation, where every lie brought new suffering and every day moved them closer to a reckoning that none of them could escape.